working on this album showed me personally that I think that there's quite a lot of music left in me. And in order to get there, it just requires to take away some of those barriers, some of those preconceived ideas of what something should be.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast, or I guess I should say welcome back to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Jon DeRosa from the band Aarktica.
And Jon has been on the podcast twice before, once to speak about Aarktica back in 2019, and just earlier this year, at the beginning of 2022, we spoke about your collaboration with Black Tape for a Blue Girl. For people who haven't heard the original Aarktica interview, how would you describe the music that you make with this project?
So Aarktica has been around for, like over 20 years now. And when I started Aarktica, it was very much like guitar-based ambient experiments, very like lo-fi tape and delays and tape manipulation and things like that. And, over the years, it kind of evolved into bringing those types of sounds into more song structures and, orchestral type elements and post-rock type sounds. So I think Aarktica is like a bit of a diverse and hard to pin down project sonically, but I would say overall like very atmospheric and definitely very ambient and definitely very guitar based.
Is the guitar your primary songwriting tool for Aarktica?
Yeah, that's like the one thing with Aarktica is that I've really very rarely used keyboards, synthesizers, and those types of elements for the ambient sounds. I'm a guitarist, and most of the basis for most songs comes from guitars and guitar effects and processing in that way.
And so the last time we spoke, it was close to the release of your album, Mareacio, your previous album.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that that album was the beginning of you using more traditional song structures?
No, I think there are albums from like the early 2000s where I was doing much more. I think songs that would probably be considered to be like shoegaze or post rock that had much more of like a standard instrumentation with drums and bass and guitars and vocals and choruses and things like that. And I actually think that Mareacio, even though there were some songs that had some traditional elements, structures to it, I was definitely still veering into a little bit more of a atmospheric and soundscape type album there. And I think with this recent album that Aarktica just put out called You'll Find the Light, it's kind of coming back around to sort of trying to use those same song structures, but also blend them more with those atmospheric elements as well, and do it in maybe a bit more seamless way than I've done it in the past.
In addition to Aarktica, you also release music under your own name, Jon DeRosa. What would you say the difference is between Aarktica and your other projects? Or the music you make as Aarktica versus
Sure.
some of the other stuff that you've done?
I started releasing albums, like under my own name in, I forget I think it was like around 2010, 2011. And I just wanted to sort of, I was getting more interested in doing like string arrangements and was more influenced by the big band singers and the more atmospheric, impressionistic elements of those artists, even like the Frank Sinatras and the those albums that had a lot of atmosphere and jazz impressionistic qualities to them. And it didn't seem to me at that time that it really fit my idea of what Aarktica was doing. So there was a time for about 8 years where I was releasing some albums under my own name, and I think those albums were distinctively more vocal albums. I think that they were more atmospheric in like a very different way. I was trying to sort of draw on a lot of those influences from the 50s and the 60s, the chamber pop elements, the big band vocal elements, and sort of turn them into a more atmospheric presentation. And so we had like an EP that I did called Anchored, and then there were two full lengths under my own name. And what I start to kind of come to realize, or where I feel like now, is that I think that those elements are starting to seep into Aarktica, where everything in the present and in the foreseeable future will be Aarktica.
Okay. In terms of your songwriting and your composition with the big band elements that you were doing under your own name and some of the string arrangements that you're doing with Aarktica. Do you have a background in composition? Like, did you go to music school or anything like that?
Yeah, I did actually. I went to when in college. Went to NYU, and I was actually studying music technology, which is a bit of a broad concentration that involved recording and things like that. But it was very heavily also based in like composition, and I had to take many instruments and all kinds of performance and all kinds of theory. So yeah, there is a little bit of that background, even though I have to admit that I wasn't really like the best student at it. But there is some of that, yeah, for sure.
I mean, when we first spoke on the podcast, we did talk a little bit about your time at NYU. I wasn't aware that composition was a part of your education. I thought it was more on the engineering side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really an interesting major. It was an interesting program because it was quite new. And in the years leading up to when I joined it was sort of a part of a music business program. So people were learning music technology and music business at the same time and learning the ins and outs of like record labels and the industry and things. And then I think it was like the year or maybe the year before that I joined, it really separated into its own thing. And a lot of emphasis was put on musicality, which was interesting because I was studying with a lot of really talented artists who were primarily DJs or primarily engineers or primarily going on to be producers. And, we had to take as much like music theory as any jazz student or as much composition as any classical student. So, I would say in general, we were often struggling because it wasn't our concentration. It wasn't necessarily our strong suit. But I think that it kind of resulted in this like really well-rounded and interesting perspective, at least for me, it was.
Now, as somebody who studied music theory, what makes a good song? Or maybe let's start with, what is a song in general? Like, how do you define a song? Because a lot of the music for Aarktica is quite open-ended in terms of structure and things like that.
Yeah.
Amorphous, I guess I should say.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it. It's been so long since I've been in that environment, and I never really, I don't approach music in that way of saying what makes a good song, and that's probably why I'm not, a Taylor Swift or one of her producers or something. Because when I listen to Taylor Swift and I listen to the production, I say this is songwriting and song crafting at its apex in terms of the science of it. And well, I do find that there is such an art to that and such a beauty to that, and it's interesting to me. It's just not how I approach it. It's not in my nature. So I'm not sure, I think it's a pretty broad, I think what is a song is a pretty broad definition.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious what your take is. I mean, we spoke a little bit about, you mentioned Taylor Swift, and I think not specific to Taylor Swift, but in terms of pop music and these pop producers, they really do have it down to a formula of like this many beats per minute, mm-hmm. and have the song in this key, and mm-hmm. Make sure that the hook is this many notes or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one, as somebody who comes from like this metal and punk background, like definitely, I understand like Metallica as like a template. You have your mm-hmm. intro, you have your verse, you have your chorus, you have your verse, you have your chorus, you have your solo, back to the verse, back to the chorus, and then you have the end. And 90% of the musicians I speak to will write songs in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But and especially as I speak to more musicians who work in an experimental or an ambient genre, obviously things are more. It's almost like the feeling. Like I'm trying to get across a certain feeling.
Yeah.
And how long that feeling goes on for, like maybe it's 20 minutes of ambient drone, and maybe it's
Yeah.
maybe it's yeah.
I
So
mean,
I'm just curious as to how you approach that side of
yeah,
it.
it's interesting. Like I talk with Sam from Black Tape for a Blue Girl about this quite a bit. Sam and again, I was on the your show with him because I sing with Black Tape for a Blue Girl, and Sam is, he is Black Tape for a Blue Girl. He does the music and he also runs Project Records. And Project is a label that puts out, I would say at this time, predominantly ambient music. And it's something that comes up a lot because, and as you know, it's like ambient music is so, there's so much out there right now. You go on Bandcamp or Spotify or whatever, and there's so many artists because it's easier than ever also to make what we would maybe refer to as ambient music. And it makes me feel like I think about the early Aarktica days when I was doing very much more ambient releases. And this was like in 99 or 2000. And that first album, Aarktica's No Solace in Sleep, I would say is still probably like the most well known or successful of the Aarktica releases. And I keep thinking that if I were to have continued in that lineage, continued in that style, that perhaps it would have maybe attracted a bigger listenership because I think people really they like for an artist to be one thing. And I'll say that I do enjoy ambient music, but I always felt that, at least for myself, in terms of creativity, I always wanted it to be something else. I always thought that ambient music serves a purpose, but there was an art in weaving those elements into song, into structure, bringing it into a context. I think about artists like Burial, for instance, who I would say is one of the best at creating a feeling, creating a moment. And I think that's what separates, an artist from being okay or, enjoyable, from being like very profound and very deep and very, having a deep impact for a listener. I also think about artists like Steve Roach, who I would say that his best works, his best ambient works, actually feel like they're breathing. They feel like they're living in some way. So, I don't know if it answers your question, but what I'm getting at is I think that, ambient music in general is something that is fairly easy to make, but to make well and to make living and to make feeling is a real art. And to make it into something where contextually people can bring it into their lives. And it's not just wallpaper, it's not just for meditation, it's not just for background. That's the art, that's special.
Ambient and experimental and noise is something that interests me, but I don't really cover on the blog or the podcast because I don't feel I can write about it or talk about it in a particularly articulate or meaningful way, because it really is like either you like it or you don't. Either you get an emotional reaction out of it or you don't.
Mm.
And for the most part, if you talk about music, music is something that has a structure to it. Music is something that's in a recognizable scale or key, whether it's a Western one or from a different culture. Music tends to have repetition, as part of its structure.
Mm-hmm.
And ambient noise, like these forms of music, and then going into like field recordings and like,
Mm-hmm.
that aspect of the experimental music scene, they really eschew like a lot of these elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of like discussing it or covering it, or it really just comes down to like, I heard it and I like it, and I don't know if there's really much more I can say about it than that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that that's great. It's like if we get too caught up in trying to explain or understand music in a head way, in a brain way, like you're saying, it's like, it has repetition and has a key change and has this, that's appreciation on one level. But the deeper appreciation is like, yeah, I don't know why I just keep coming back to this song. It just makes me feel good, or just makes me feel calm, and that's why I keep coming back to it. I think that's much more special, and that's much more like as an artist, like that's what I would love to hear from someone. Is that, yeah, I don't know why I like it. It's just there's something that makes me feel good, or there's something that just makes me want to hear it. It's that undefinable quality.
You mentioned that you didn't stick with just making ambient music, and you didn't want Aarktica to just be, within that realm or within that genre.
Mhm.
Why is that?
I think that, and maybe this is like speaks, to my like weaknesses or, like character in some ways. It's like I felt that I felt like I needed to push myself. I felt like I needed to challenge myself. I found it, I don't want to say I found it easy to make music like that, but I found it like, it was almost like I was like, okay, I understand how to do this. I can do this 100 times. I can make this album, you know, 10 more times. I know how to do it now. And it wasn't something that felt, fulfilling creatively for me. That's not as to say intend any disrespect to artists that stick to a genre. It was just that at that time for me, I was like, 20 years old and I was restless creatively and I wanted to do more. I was starting to get into bands like Mogwai and Hood, and there was so much interesting post rock, experimental type stuff that was coming out in the early 2000s that I was like, I want to have beats in my music. I want to I want to take these ambient elements and turn them into structures. I want to add vocals and make them into, moments in time that are somehow different than what I'm doing now with just the guitars and the ambience and stuff. So I think that that's what it was. It was like a little bit of me feeling like I wanted to challenge myself. I felt like it was me wanting to create my own identity, you know. I didn't want to there were bands like Wendy and Carl that I loved. There were bands like Flying Saucer Attack that I loved. Bands like Azusa Plain that I loved. All were doing guitar ambient excursions that were so beautiful. And I was like, I want to make Aarktica something special. I want to do something that no one else is doing, or that's distinctively me. And I think that that's what led me to trying to bring in different styles and instrumentation and arrangements and things like that.
So the 10th Aarktica album is
Mm-hmm.
called We Will Find the Light,
Mm-hmm.
and it was released at the end of September 2022 through Darla Records.
Mm-hmm.
When did you begin work on these songs?
Believe it or not, I started writing this record in January of this year. So it was a relatively short amount of time between the time that I wrote the album to the time I recorded the album and to the time that it was released. It all happened, I would say, in a span of like 9 months.
Did you go into this album wanting to do anything specific, or, maybe to differentiate what you were doing with Sam with Black Tape, or maybe to continue what you were doing from Mareacio, the previous album?
I hadn't felt very inspired to write music in many years. Even Mareacio, even though it came out in 2019, it was a very patchwork album, meaning that it wasn't something I wrote all at once. I kind of pulled it together from, maybe this I worked on 5 years ago, and this I worked on a few years ago, and it wasn't as if the creativity was like flowing for many years, is I guess what I'm saying. And it started to really, feel like a problem for me. I was like, maybe I just don't have, maybe I just don't have it left. I don't have any inspiration left. And I kind of sat with it for a while. And what I realized I was kind of putting myself through was sort of, I think I think the fact that I had this project, that Aarktica had been a thing for like 20 years, I had this sort of idea in my head that it had to be a certain thing. And I also realized that over the 20 years, I really compartmentalized so many of my projects. I had my solo stuff as Jon DeRosa. I was doing Pale Horse and Rider, which was a bit of a country thing, singing with Black Tape for a Blue Girl, and all these other projects in between. And I realized that I think for me, when I limit myself and sort of put barriers on what something has to be, it's a limit to creativity. It's a limit to what's possible. And I started to like break that down a little bit. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to write some songs on my classical guitar because I play my classical guitar every day. And even though it's not an instrument I associate with Aarktica, that doesn't matter. This is going to be what I'm working with. And I think once I started to get rid of all these like preconceived ideas, all these songs like started to just come. And I think that that's why for me this is an important album because I think going forward, I can't envision ever putting any kind of limitation on myself that way. I think that, from this point forward, anything I create is in whatever style and whatever instrumentation, it's uh, it's still Aarktica, it's still me because it's just what it is. It doesn't need to be something. It doesn't need to be this creation in my mind that that I'm making it out to be. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but I guess what I'm saying is that when I try to put a limitation, when I try to put a expectation on something, creativity starts to hinder, and that's not something that I plan to do anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that Mareacio was more of a patchwork album. Would you say that this album, by comparison, is more cohesive?
Yeah, and I think that it's also because it was written in a shorter period of time. It was written, I think songs, and again, I don't know for most songwriters, but for me, the best song is written in one sitting. It's a moment in time, it's a moment you capture and it's done and you have it. I think songs that you start and then come back to later, they might be nice and they might be great, but it's like I think there's something to be said for having the balls really to just say, look, this is done right now and I'll write more songs later, but in this moment this is done. I think it lends itself to a more cohesive album in as a whole when you have songs like that, and you have songs that you have the confidence to say this is done now, or I have the discipline to say that I'm finishing this tonight.
Now, was that a problem for you in the past, working and reworking songs?
Yeah, I've never been able to do that. It's very rare. I think there was only one other time in my life that I wrote a song in one sitting from start to finish. And in this album, there were several of them. So yeah. Because you're also saying like, hey, you know what? It might not be perfect, but that's fine. It's like it's not the end all be all. It's like this is me right in this moment. There's time to write more. There's always another album.
And as far as this album, when did you feel that you were done? Or when did you know that you were done?
That's a good question. A lot of these songs, I started working with a producer named Lewis Pesacov. I hadn't worked with him before. And he was really great because there were a few songs that I brought into studio and intended to record in a certain way. And, he helped me turn them into something different in a really beautiful way. So, I went into the studio with an idea of an album, and I'll say that it came out, I left the studio with a really beautiful album, but I would say half of it was very different than what I expected it to be. So, um, so yeah, I thought I had an album, and then I went to the studio, and it certainly was an album, but there were some definite differences and changes we made. Yeah.
Different how? Different in terms of the instrumentation that you used, or maybe the way the song structures changed?
I think a little bit of everything. I think that, I had written like a whole classical guitar like suite that I intended to have on this album in 5 pieces, 5 parts. And we ended up using some of those pieces and we processed them a certain way, and some of them turned into more ambient pieces. Some of them didn't end up on the album. Some of the vocal songs I intended to be a little bit less straightforward, and they ended up being, we arranged them in such a way that they were very vocal forward. So I think that that's speaks to like Lewis's strengths as a producer, because a producer takes the artist's strengths. He hears things that the artist maybe doesn't hear. An artist is very like possessive of his own work sometimes, and says, no, this is what it is. And I think the producer's job is to say, you know what, this is really strong, and here's what I'm hearing, and this is, I think, interesting. And I think that that's what makes that relationship really beautiful.
It's been a while since I let you in, since I let you in. Can't say I've missed you, I can't say I've missed you. Can't say I've missed you. Where you been, oh, where you been, oh. Can't say I've missed you. It's been a long time. What can I tell you? Oh, what can I tell you? I was just a child, I was just a child. I was just a child, I was just a child. Seeing the world, oh, seeing the world. Everything was for the first time. Everything was just the first time. Bye, 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 bye. life goes on and life goes on. Life goes on and life goes on. The tears in your eyes, they magnify. Tears in your eyes, they magnify. Joy and sorrow just the same. Joy and sorrow just the same. Those tears in your eyes, they magnify. Joys and sorrows just the same. Life goes on and life goes on. Life goes on and life goes on. Die, 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 die,
So we were speaking about Lewis Pesacov, who produced the album. Lewis is known for his work with, I mean, basically everyone in the indie rock scene. He's worked with St. Vitus, he's worked with Vampire Weekend, he's worked with some very prominent indie rock musicians. First of all, had you worked with Lewis before?
I hadn't worked with him, but I had met him. And I had actually met with him when I was getting ready to mix Mareacio, and I was considering working with him for that. And I forget, for whatever reason, we just didn't, but I always liked, I remember liking him a lot, and we got along really well. We have a lot in common, and he's just like a super nice and cool guy. So I'd always want, after meeting him, I was like, I gotta work with Lewis. And when I started to finish up writing this album, I reached out to him.
In terms of producer, because producer can be a nebulous term in terms of recording and I think when, especially on this podcast, when I speak to people about who produced the album or who the producer of their album was, a lot of times what they're talking about is an engineer or somebody who's very involved with the actual literal recording of hitting record and placing their mics and that aspect of the album's creation.
Yeah.
As a producer, what was Lewis's role?
Lewis also engineered the album, so he did, everything that you're talking about as well. But I think, the difference is like an engineer is purely technical. An engineer is going to know, the mic placement and the recording techniques and anything that's technological. A producer, in my experience and in my vision, is going to have more creative input. The producer is going to have some feedback in terms of how to bring out the best of the artist, how to make the songs sound the best. And that feedback is going to most certainly be beyond a technical level. It's going to be more on a creative level. So I would say that in this circumstance, that was most certainly the case.
Was that something that you were specifically looking for Lewis to contribute to the album? His feedback as far as arrangements and instrumentation and things like that?
Yeah, I did want I did want some collaboration on that. I, it's like I trust myself to a certain degree, but I'm not a controlling or perfectionist person. I am always open to what someone else may hear in what I'm bringing to the table. And I started working with people in this context as a producer. And, when I lost my hearing in my right ear when I was like 19 years old, and I started to rely on a producer or engineer in that way because I didn't trust my own sense of what I was creating, in a purely from an engineering standpoint. But I think when you have a solo project or a project that's predominantly a one person project like myself, I really think that it benefits from having someone you trust present some feedback, because we get, as a solo artists, we get in this headspace where we see things one way, and I think that we miss things. I think that we benefit from hearing other opinions. And I know for me personally, it helps me. So in this case, I did ask Lewis, I said, look, I'm going to be bringing these songs to the table, and I have an idea of what I want to do, but your studio and you know what you're capable of. And, I want you to give me some feedback and throw some ideas out there, some things I've never thought of before. And yeah, I think that's how we worked.
So I need to correct one thing that I said. I think I said that Lewis worked with Saint Vitus. I meant Saint Vincent. Sorry.
I don't know.
I'm a metalhead, so I fall into old habits very easily. Saint Vitus comes up a lot more on this podcast than Saint Vincent does.
Saint Vincent sounds more correct. I forget 100% of who he's worked with. I know that one of the bands that he's most known for was that band Best Coast. I think he did their first album, and Best Coast became a pretty big band. And I think that sound, that sort of dreamy indie pop, indie rock West Coast sound, became very distinctive. And I don't think that it's something that Lewis is specifically like. I don't think it's like his specific sound or anything, but he's definitely like integral in creating that. So I think he gets associated with that quite a bit. But he got nominated for like a Grammy this past year for like a classical recording that he did. So he's like a really like diverse dude. He's worked on a lot of different types of albums.
And there are classical and string elements on this album as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to mention who your collaborators were?
Oh yeah, sure. So on this album, I worked with Henrik Meidercord, and Henrik actually is from Sweden. I've never met him in person. I know him because he's also the string player for Black Tape for a Blue Girl. So, I sent him the songs as they were in progress, and he added elements, and he was amazing to work with. I really loved what he brought to the table. And my longtime friend, Charles Newman, who is often my producer, but this time he just contributed some keyboards. And there was a song or two that I sang with a friend and collaborator named Nicole La Liberte, who many of you may know because she's an actress and she played Daria in Twin Peaks, the newest Twin Peaks. And she's a good friend as well. So those were the players on this album.
You mentioned some of the shoegaze recordings, or I guess that sound that Lewis is known for. Did you want to capture aspects of that sound on this latest Aarktica album?
I gotta be honest, like I don't know if I've even ever listened to a Best Coast album. I don't, I think I've heard a song or two. I just clicked with him as a person, and I knew that he was capable of doing a diverse array of sounds. I liked his setup. I liked his gear. We have some similarities. We have some roots in Indian music, Indian classical music. He had heard Aarktica, and I knew he was familiar with albums I'd done in the past. And when we spoke on the phone and I explained what I was looking to do, he was like, yeah, I think we can make something interesting happen. So I didn't really turn to him because of a particular band or artist he'd worked with. It was purely his personality, presence, and I also just knew he was really good at what he did.
So what was that initial conversation? What were you looking for Lewis to do?
I think that I was a little, I would say a little timid because I hadn't been really in the studio for a long time. I hadn't made an Aarktica record. Again, I made Mareacio, but the last Aarktica record that really felt like a full record where I went in and did it from start to finish was In C, which was like, over 10 years ago. And I didn't have a lot of confidence. And I really was like, look, I have these ideas. I have these songs. I need help into turning them into something special. And I sent him some demos and explained, what I'd like to do and what my vision of them was. And he was like, yeah, I think that that's great. And I think we can do it. And so, it wasn't like a huge serious thing. I think it was just, we got along and I felt really good and comfortable and we ended up working together.
Did you end up tracking at Lewis's studio, or did you record your parts at in your own home studio?
Actually, this album is actually, now that I think of it, I did it entirely at Lewis's. We did a few overdubs at Charles's place. I did a few overdubs with my friend Tom at his studio, but in general, yeah, the whole album we tracked at Lewis's other than that.
Okay. How did that feel? Because I know Mareacio was mostly recorded on your own, and I think you recorded your parts for Black Tape on your own as well, right?
Yeah. It's like home recording for me, even though like I went to school for it and stuff, I feel like I have like limitations in terms of my expertise, my gear, my knowledge. So I can do a certain level of home recording. And to be honest, it felt good to have to be in a place where I didn't have to worry about the technological aspect. I just wanted to show up and be the artist for once, not worry about, what cables weren't working, what programs weren't working, what signal wasn't coming through strong enough. I was like, I'm coming in to just be the singer, to be the guitarist, to be the whatever. And I trust Lewis 100% to do everything else. So I think that it allowed a little bit more focus on the musicality, which I was all happy about, to be honest.
Siete colores tiene loca iris, con siete guerreros en su inhalaquina, que canta la historia de Mamacocha. La madre del agua que el corazón abre. Agua cristalina, cristalina, quid, donde siete camadas se vuelven uno, un solo rostro de amor puro y sano, surgiendo del profundo del ser humano. Ne canta nai 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 Siete caminos, siete miradas, traes a nación a la ilusión, eleva el alma de la humanidad, que se está abriendo a la verdad. Entre tempestades de los rayos, vaya en ti el Padre constante, besó a mis manos, mis rostros, mis pies, trayéndome el agradecimiento a todo. ¿Qué van haciendo?
Mareacio dealt a lot with plant medicine and shamanistic healing. Is that a topic, or are those themes that you're continuing on this album as well?
Yeah, I think that it's certainly a theme that carries into this record, although I think that it's done in a little bit more of a subtle way, more of like maybe an integrated way. On this particular album, there's two songs that I would, covers actually, that I would categorize as medicine songs, songs that we might sing in a shamanic ceremony, in a plant medicine ceremony. These are songs, Serenita Bobansana And the other is in Portuguese and it's hard to pronounce. So I always call it Siete Colores. So I would say those songs in particular carry that theme into this album. And even the songs that, the originals that are vocal songs carry those themes of healing and transformation. The ambient songs that are more instrumental, I think also carry a sort of theme of the sort of maybe otherworldliness or sort of representing like a different level of consciousness. So I do think that these themes were something that I consciously were carrying into this album, but perhaps in a little bit more, as I said, a more integrated way, something that wove in more seamlessly and is not as perhaps obvious or over the top as I was doing with Mareacio.
Now, for the two songs that you covered, were these songs that you had a prior relationship to, or were you searching out for things included on the album that had that aspect of musical healing and shamanistic music?
These were songs that I had been singing in ceremonies for probably 8 years, or 6 or 8 years, maybe. Actually, more like 8 or 9. I don't know. For quite a while, I'll say. I can't remember exactly. So I had a deep relationship with these songs. One was the one that I'm referring to as Siete Colores, was written by a singer named Mariana Root, and Serenita Bobinsana was written by Arthur Mena. Mariana is a Portuguese songwriter, and Arthur Mena is from Peru. And I think that, these were the songs that I sing, when I'm alone. These are the songs that I sing for self-soothing. These are the songs that I sing for healing when I'm working with others. So there was a bit of like vulnerability maybe, or like a sharing of something that was special in the fact that I was bringing it into this record for me.
We spoke a little bit in 2019 about your relationship with somatic healing and, your music's relationship with what you do in that regard as well. Mm. Would you describe this album as a healing record?
I think that, for me, it was. For me, it brought me through some things that I was working through. I never liked to sort of impose a feeling or a meaning for other people. I think that someone can listen to this album and enjoy it for the musicality or for the songs. But I do think on a deep listening level, there are themes of healing and redemption and working through trauma. So I think it's certainly, it's certainly a primary theme of the lyrics and the music. Yeah.
Tell me about the label that's releasing this, Darla.
So Darla Records, has been around since I think the mid 90s. And in the mid 90s, Darla was really a great label for indie rock, indie pop, all kinds of really interesting stuff. I mean, they were really doing great stuff. As a young person, I signed with Darla and put out some of the earlier Aarktica albums. I think 2001, I put out the Bliss Out album, which was like the second Aarktica full length, or the third Aarktica album in general. And I worked with them and put out, I'm trying to think what other albums. Bleeding Light was one Aarktica album I put out with them. When I was doing my project Pale Horse and Rider, which was like a little bit of a country-esque project, I released a couple albums with Darla. And then we kind of parted ways for like over a decade or so. And when it came time to start writing this album, I was also around the time that I reached back out to Darla and we started chatting again and reconnecting. And James and his wife Chandra, who run Darla, were interested in working with me on this album, and it's been really great. It's been nice to really be reconnected with them again.
Does the label mostly focus on ambient and experimental stuff?
No, Darla's like pretty eclectic. I mean, over the years, Darla has put out really eclectic stuff. I'd say that maybe their most And they're also a label distributor too, so they're distributing a lot of labels. I'd say on Darla, I mean, maybe their most well-known artist would be, they signed My Morning Jacket. They were the first label to put out My Morning Jacket. Most recently, they've released albums by, I think the artist that they just released along with my own is called Isolated Gate, which is one of the gentlemen from the band The Pale Saints, who were a great band on 4AD in the 90s. They also released music by a band called Sweet Trip, and pretty eclectic, electronic, indie rock, indie pop, sort of all over the map. Not as much. I think I'd probably be one of the more ambient type artists on the label. I know for a long time they were also releasing music by Robin Guthrie from the Cocteau Twins.
There was a 10-year gap between when you released In Sea to when you resurrected Aarktica or started releasing music again as Aarktica.
Mm-hmm.
In releasing the music under the Aarktica name again, do you see this as a new era of the band? Like, do you see this as separate from what you had done in the past, or maybe like a reimagining of what you had done before?
I definitely think that it feels like a bit of a new beginning. I definitely feel like with this album, I felt a bit re-inspired, and I've been writing more since I released this album. So I think that we'll see more Aarktica music in the next year. I think that, again, like as I was talking about before, working on this album showed me personally that I think that there's quite a lot of music left in me. And in order to get there, it just requires to take away some of those barriers, some of those preconceived ideas of what something should be. So, in that way, I would say you're correct that maybe it is the next chapter or a new chapter or another phase of this project for sure.
And as far as the new music that you're going to be releasing, do you want to give an inkling as to what that would be, or do you have an idea of where you want to go in the future?
Well, I have an album of music I worked on with Henrik, actually the string player. That's more of an instrumental album, more ambient album that I'm kind of currently finishing up. And it feels good to have that out of my system. But I think after this, I'll be back to writing more song type more song type music. But again, I don't know. We'll see. I don't want to try. I don't want to paint myself into a corner. So we'll see how it feels. I just want to get through this year. That's my goal, to get through this year.
Well, we don't have long to go, right?
Yeah, but anything can happen. So
yeah, this is true. The music that you're writing with Henrik, will this be Aarktica music, or would it be for something else?
Yes, it'll be Aarktica.
Okay. So We Will Find the Light is out now through Darla Records. Jon, how can people order the album?
So We Will Find the Light is available. We have a limited edition double LP. It's limited to only 300 copies. And also it's on CD. Both of those formats are available at darla.com and also at the Aarktica Bandcamp. And Aarktica is AARKTICA. So Aarktica.bandcamp.com or darla.com.
And do you want to say anything about the physical releases that Darla is putting out?
Yeah, the We'll Find the Light on double vinyl is incredible. They did a really great job. It's a gatefold package, limited to 300. It's the first time Aarktica has ever had a full-length release on vinyl, and I know that most of them have sold already. So it's something to, if you are a fan or curious or a vinyl collector, certainly something to pick up and get a hold of. And Darla also has a lot of the Aarktica back catalog available as well on CD and on both at the Darla web shop and the Aarktica Bandcamp.
And if people want to follow Aarktica online and keep up to date with news and any new releases that you'll be putting out, what's the best way to do that?
I mean, my medium of choice is Instagram, so Aarktica_official on Instagram. It's also on Facebook as Aarktica, if you search Aarktica. That's Aarktica.com as well. So yeah, those would be, and also on Twitter as Aarktica, although it's not my favorite. So Instagram or Facebook would probably be the best.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I think we're good, but I really appreciate your time, Adrian.
Cool. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you.
If ever a morning will be when the sun breaks his vows with the sea, does not ascend, leaving darkness abound, that's how I'd feel if you left me. I'm grateful I found me in you. I'm grateful that you found me too. There may come a day where we go our own ways. I'm grateful for that lesson too. So good night, good night, good night, good night. Hear my voice in the shadow light. Good night, good night, good night, good night. One last dance before they take the light. One last dance before they take the light. I remember the evening we wed, when you brought me back from the dead and showed me that love was a form worthy of, and more so, that it's a real thing. We danced as the moon waxed and waned, though wounded off step and untrained. I prayed to be healed, and the wound slowly seemed as if our imperfect beauty was medicine. So good night, good night, good night, good night. Hear my voice in the shadow light. Good night, good night, good night, good night. One last dance before they take the light. One last dance before they take the light. A year in the wild I spent, without a sword or a tent. I was in search of you, but you had things to do. So back to the cities But even the greatest trees fall, no matter how deep their roots go. And I only pray when it's time to be laid, I find a way to do it with beauty. So good night, good night, good night, good night. Hear my voice in the shadowed light. Good night, good night, good night, good night. One last dance before they take the light. One last dance before they take the light. Last dance before they take the light. One last dance before they take the